Hello, hello, hello. Is everyone okay? Can everybody hear me? Yeah, cool, excellent. Hi, welcome to Styles, Trends, Immersion, and Abstraction, Developing UI Art Direction talk. If you take nothing away from my presentation today, please take this away. Having a really long title for your talk looks great on paper, but when you have to tell people the name of your talk, it's impossible, so don't do it, don't recommend it. I'm Leanne Bailey. I am the UI and UX discipline head for Atom Hawk, specifically on the advanced team, and I'm a massive nerd. I've been playing video games forever, it seems. My favorite game ever might be Nights into Dreams on the Sega Saturn, which is at the point where I realized that, yeah, I'm a nerd for life at this point, and this is my major hobby. And if you've read any of my profile descriptions, it will say that I'm a 2-time Gamer Bake winner. And that is the first apron cake that I won. That was called Prepare to Diet, combining my love of Dark Souls and baking. And yeah, I work for Atom Hawk, the now developed Star Award-winning Atom Hawk, because I believe we picked up an award last night at the show. A little bit about us. We're founded in 2009, providing creative services. So we have a bunch of different service lines, from concept art, character art, environment art, graphic design, motion and graphic design, 3D art, UI, UX, technical art. We got it all. We have 3 offices. We have 3 studio locations and also a large remote team as well. And we work with the games industry to make the unbelievable believable. So yeah, I work on the advanced team. We were set up just before the pandemic, so we were established as a remote team. And we are, on our team, we have tech artists, engineers, UI artists and designers, and UX designers. So we partner up with studios, we embed with the teams, and we help, facilitate solutions, come up with all of your answers. We're a team that's built up from people who've worked in the games industry. So we know your pain points. We've been there. We've worked through them before. We can help you get through yours. And I promise that's the last of the sales pitch. So let's talk about UI art. Put your little bit of audience participation, hands up if you yourself have to work with UI art at all. Okay, cool, that's awesome. So this is like a stupid slide then, because most of you spend all of your time talking about UI art. But what I found from my time working in the industry is we tend to not talk about it enough, or we don't talk about it enough at the right times. And we certainly don't talk about it enough at the right times with the right people. And I find that, and the whole presentation is very anecdotal, so there's that caveat at the start, but if your design team that you're working with on a project don't have a player-centric designer in that team of the people heading up your project, this conversation gets lost to the last possible moment. We know the game will have a UI. It has to at some point, because that's how we're going to communicate how many pumpkins you've got at the moment. But we don't talk about it early enough in the production pipeline unless you've got somebody in that creative suite who's very much about, well, how would the player react to this game? How will they work with it? So first of all, we're going to talk about UX though, actually, because you can't have a good UI for your game if it doesn't serve the UX really well. And the first thing we need to consider when we're coming up with any of our art for any of the game is, okay, but what is the user experience that we're working with here? And I'm not talking about the wireframes for the game. We're not looking at this stage at what are all the flows for the menus and what is our gray boxes looking like, what is our HUD matrix built up like. When you're sitting down and you're starting to talk about, we're going to be creating what our art direction is for our game, for our UI, at this stage we just care about the vibes of your game. Hopefully, it doesn't matter where you are in the production line of your game, you've got this idea of what the vibe is. We know what kind of a player experience we're trying to build with this game. And that's the thing we're going to focus on for the start of this talk is, what is the vibe of your game? When you describe it to a player, how do you describe it? How did they understand the game that you're making? I try to keep my my part slides as cryptic as possible. So having had that conversation with your team and understanding what the vibe of your game is, we're going to take a line, which is actually a bar, but bars look more visually impactful on a big screen than a line, so we've got a bar. But to make this a usable metric, to make this usable for how we're going to develop our UI, we need to add some headers on here. So what we're actually going to have is a scale. And at one end, we're going to put immersion, and at the other end, we're going to put abstraction. So hopefully immersion is very understood, like it's a known term. We're making a game where the player forgets that they're playing a game. Like they suspend their disbelief, they're very much in the moment, they're very much in the game. We're making it an immersive experience. And not all games have to be, not all games need to be that level of immersive. Some games are very abstracted experiences. We know we're playing a video game. It's got scores and it's got stars at the end of the thing. It's very arcadey, or it's very fast-paced, or it's very action-oriented. We're aware that we're playing a video game, and that's what we wanted from it. We wanted people to know that they're playing a game. Totally fine. Doesn't matter where on this line you are. What matters is that you have an idea of what the vibe of your game is and where you're going to plot yourself on this line. So, for example, if you had a sci-fi third-person survival horror game, you're probably going to be pitching that way down in Immersion Town, because otherwise your game isn't going to land with the players. It's not going to be scary if they are, aware of their score counter at the time. If they're trying to get an awesome combo, the horror's probably not going to be hitting. But if you're making an arcadey, score attack, mobile rhythm action game, then that's an abstracted experience. Like, I'm not actually playing the guitar, but I'm getting a really good score. I'm not actually singing this song very well, but I've hit the line. Little note, if your game could be pitched all the way over here, like the other side of Immersion, you're probably making Journey. It's a game that has like no UI. And also then you can just go get a coffee because we're done here. But yeah, if your game is like really far down here, it's probably going to have very little in the way of an actual, what we would like term your user interface art. Another way that we can use this line, or rather another thing to bear in mind with this line, is it is not an exact science. We're not saying that our game is going to be 75% abstracted. We're just getting a feel for it. We just want to plot somewhere so that we've got our starting point. And we can use this as a bit of a timeline as well. So if you've sat down with your team and you've realized we're making a really immersive game experience, that's what we want our players to get from this, then you probably need to start working on your UI as early as possible. You can't make a very immersive experience if you're just doing it in the last 3 months of production. And if you're making a very abstracted game, sometime before launch, get a UI in there. But plan for it. Make sure your production team are on board. There are arguments to be said that it helps if you leave it as late as possible, so long as you've planned for it and you're not crunching your UI team. My second cryptic header. So we've started with a line and we have our feel for the game, and we know somewhere on here we're going to pitch it as being quite an immersive experience or quite an abstracted experience. So the next thing we need to do is add some layers onto this so we can actually determine what our art style is going to be. Our first layer we're going to look at is where we're going to get our art from. On this end of the scale by immersion, we've got from the game world. And over the other end of the scale by abstraction, we've got a metaphor. So the more immersive an experience you're making, the more you're going to lean into diegetic elements. Your UI is going to be built in and of the game world that you're creating, which is another reason why you need to get those conversations started as early as possible, because you can't just have a stick-on HUD for this. It's going to have to be very much more involved. But if you're making it a more abstracted experience, then we can just kind of lift something from the game that we like the look of and we want to use that as the basis. One of your characters might have a really nice hat and you're like, that, we're going to build our UI based on this hat. That's fine. It's not of the game world exactly, which is using it as a bit of a metaphor for the UI. So some examples of this. If we were Over here, we're making an immersive experience, and we're going to be lifting our UI from the game world. Alien Isolation does this in spades. Like, it absolutely nailed the assignment. All of the UI in this game is built from the technology of the game world. And it helped that they had like a really a huge back catalog of information that they could look at to build this. Like, you've got the film series. They did a lot of work in making this world believable and lived in, and they took that and they carried it forward in their UI. They had a rule on this where it was, if they couldn't have made it in 1979 to be a part of that film, we didn't make it for the UI. It wasn't going in. So everything in this game, all of the UI moments that you experience, all the ones that keep you in that moment are they're very well researched. And they did look at this like, could we make it with the technology back then? No, we need to find another solution. And going back to like the original point of the vibes, like, it understood the UX of this game incredibly well. It knew that it was going to have these moments that were clunky on purpose. It was going to have these moments where the player had to make a choice. Most games these days, if you turn around and said, oh, you're going to use a save point, people would be like, no, come on, we've moved on from that. Save points are so 2002. But with this game, it's like, you're going to put yourself at risk to use this piece of user interface to make sure that you've banked your progress so far. You have to make noise. You have to expose yourself. You could get jumped on at any point. You can't look around while you're doing it. So it leans into the horror of this game, the survival elements of this game, because we're making you interact with the environment in this way. So I think Alien Isolation is a very perfect example of, we've got an immersive experience. We're going to build the UI from the game world that we're creating. If we looked at something that's at the other end of that scale, we have an extracted game experience that we're going to build off of a metaphor. I think a really good example of this is Genshin Impact. So the metaphors that they looked at for this one, or what they lent into for this one, we've got spell books and we've got constellations. So it looked at the world that they've got, and they've got this like idea of like magic, of these constellations for the characters. There's books everywhere, so it's like, we're going to use some of that. But they just used it as a reference point for the UI. This menu is a bit more obviously book-related on the mobile version, I think, than the PlayStation version. I can't remember which way around it is. But that blue bar is the ribbon from the book. It's got like the little notch at the bottom. So they had this idea of like, okay, so then our menus are going to be pages. Cool, we can work with that. And they used the constellations as well quite heavily through other menus, different areas of the game, and just had this like magic and sparkle and motion kind of behind everything. But yeah, very much, I know I'm playing a video game when I'm playing Genshin Impact. So there's a couple of examples of building our UI where we're taking those moments from. Is it going to be from the game world? Is it going to be from a metaphor loosely based around the game world? So the next layer we're going to look at is going to be, when are we getting our art from? This end, again, we're looking at the era or art movement that the game is set in. And the other end of the scale, we're thinking more about what's trending now, like what's happening in the world outside of our video game. So actually, this could also be place. It could be like game world and outside of game world. So to put some more examples on here, because everything's better with pictures. If you were looking at an immersive experience in the game world, looking at the era or movement, Pentiment is a great example of this. This game is set in 1518, and it is key to the experience that you play that you might, you don't have to know that. I know that, but you don't have to know. But it's very much of this time. And whereas Genshin Impact had this idea of like, we're going to use these spell books and we're going to use that as a metaphor for our UI, Pentiment is the book. Like, you're playing it as an image inside the book. And everything leans on this medieval, not medieval, because it's modern era, but this illustrative world that the game's set in, where it's the printing press has started to come about, and it's like threatening the livelihood of these these manuscript writers, these artists that are handwriting the book still. And like, just as a side note, I really love that long pointy finger. And what I also love about this game is the font choices that they went with and how they continue to tell the story through the fonts that they were using for the different people in the story. And they just went to town on this. Like, as a UI designer, to see the love that they put into fonts, usually with fonts, it's like, okay, you can have 3. But these guys are like, no, we want the kitchen sink as well. And also, our fonts are going to be animated so that they are written and the ink dries. But they also recognize that that's not going to work for every player, so they gave options to make it more accessible, which I also truly respect them for. And incidentally, my notes on this slide is try not to gush about Pentiment. Brackets probably fail. So there's that. But I highly recommend Pentiment if you haven't experienced it yet. So on the other end of the scale, again, we've got an abstracted experience that is based on a metaphor that is sort of trending now. We're going to look at Voez, which actually came out in 2016. But at the time when it came out, this is a rhythm mobile game that didn't look like any other rhythm mobile games at the time. And I don't know if they were going for the hipster like cross icon as one of the anchor points for their UI on this one, or if it was just a happy accident of having this diamond shape throughout the game. But it was very on trend for 2016 when it came out. Everywhere was coming out with these icons that had like the letters or like anchors and keys in this cross. But those really lent into this like design choice. Everything in this game is a diamond or a triangle, or it has that using the negative space of those shapes to come up with the crosses. And again, like, you know, we're looking at flat design, we're looking at very clean design. The fact that this game is like 7 years old at this point and it still looks pretty fresh, it's just like they really did their research and they came up with like a really stunning presentation for their project. It's also a really fun game if you like J-pop and rhythm action mobile games. I did say I was a massive nerd, didn't I? But this builds up our onion. So these are the layers that we will be looking at along this scale. Somewhere we're going to plot a point and we're going to look at these different areas of like, okay, how are we building our UI up? What are the things that we want to take away from this? Part 3 is the box. Okay. So we're going to cap all of this off with our next point that we need to look at, which is genre and platform. Looking at the genre that the game is that we're building and the target platforms that we want to launch that game on. And the reason we want to do this is because of affordances and competition, which again is leading into like more a UX sense, but also it's important for our UI because players are going to have expectations of your game. They're going to be judging it against every other game that they've played in that genre and most of the games that they've played on that platform. So you need to know what those things are. And, you know, competitive analysis is always a good idea because you want to see where you're pitching yourself. You want to see what you're coming up against. I mean, as an example, if your game has, you know, a hierarchy of loot in it, you are going to need to have these colors in your game somewhere or a variation of them. I do recommend to pick pink instead of purple because the purple and the blue are too close for me. But players understand this scale. They know what this means. So you need to know what it means when you're coming up with your color palette for your UI. And when we say, like, you want to go out there and you want to do a competitor analysis, you want to look at what the market is doing for the genre that you're making, you don't necessarily have to copy them. You just have to know what they're doing. I swear that some of these games are the same game. They want to bash on like idle brawlers for mobile games, but if I didn't know that they were all different games, I wouldn't know that they were all different games. And AAA is as guilty. So we've kind of like, we found this design that we like. We've got the minimalistic, flat UI. Everything's a little bit monochromatic. Again, you don't have to copy what your, it's that whole meme of like, you kind of copy your homework. Yeah, just don't make it obvious kind of thing. And if anything, this style we're diving a little bit deeper into it. It is becoming more minimalistic. It is becoming more monochromatic. We're using the negative space, the white space a lot more as well in these designs. But this design, flat design, hit the UI world pretty hard as a reaction to what was the UI design before that. Everything was skeuomorphic. Everything was based on real-world elements, and it was a bit 3D, and it was, WinApp skins and all that kind of stuff. And the rebellion against that was to have this very flat design where everything was not gradients or shaded or rendered to look like a real-world object. And if you do have your UI Game Talk bingo card that was diegetic, skeuomorphic, like somebody's going to get a bingo. Just credits for those titles. So what comes after this? So at the moment, we're trending very heavily in everything is flat, everything is monochromatic. So what's starting to come up is maximalism. Everybody wants to look at making these interesting images, these collage images, and they range from very current stuff to very retro stuff. Everything can look a bit kitsch. And the rebellion against everything being monochromatic and everything being very starkly black and white is to introduce really vivid colors to the palette, really go bold with some of the choices we make. Like the new brutalist style is really everywhere on the internet right now. So if you were looking at introducing that to your game, now is the time to have that UI aesthetic going in. And where everything is this very flat design, we're seeing, I think glassmorphism is coming back, you guys, and holomorphism and having textures. So it's not skeuomorphic in the sense of we've got a bookcase and a book on it and that's our icon, but we're going to take glass or metal or holographic film and that's going to be our texture and that's going to look very realistically rendered, but we're just going to apply it as a choice to our UI. And I unironically love holomorphism as well. Like anything that's got that purpley blue color scheme is very cool. And retro is in, and it doesn't matter what kind of retro you're after. Any retro is in. We just don't want to live in this age, apparently. But the fact that Y2K aesthetic is coming back just fills me with cringe. But, awkward teenage me is actually kind of living for some of the elements that are coming back from that era. But it doesn't matter if it's 90s or 70s or 80s, it's all coming in. So the point of this bit is we need to think about what that box is. You've got all of these rules, all of these things that players are expecting. Do you work within that? Do you stick inside the box, or do you work outside of the box? Do you want to create a UI that no one else is doing to stand out from that crowd, or do you want to keep with what players know and they expect? And it doesn't matter what side of this you are, so long as you're aware of the choices that you're making and why you want to make them. Okay, so we've got our vibe, we've pitched it on the line, we've looked at where we want to get our art from, we've looked at when we want to get our art from, we've done some market research and we've considered what our competitors are doing, what's trending, where we want to put ourselves on all of this. And the reasons why we want to do this, the reason why we want to go through this process is because it helps us to build some really strong foundations and consistency throughout our UI art. You're going through all of this with the sole purpose of building some really key anchor points. So any decisions that you make when it comes to how you want to present the UI in the game, you know why you're doing it. And you can always refer back to this as okay, that's a really cute idea, but does it line up with everything that we've set up so far when establishing our UI art? And if you do this, and you go through this process, and you have a really strong case for this is our visualization of it, this is all working together with the UX, this is working with the design, this is working with all of the other departments in our game, what you end up with is a strong UI that you can pretty much tell what the game is without seeing the rest of the game. You can identify it just on its UI elements. And if you've really understood the UX and you know why you're making the choices you make, it might not be obvious on first play, but when you go back to it, okay, they made decisions on this hard because the whole game's supposed to be hard. Or they made decisions on this because they wanted people to cosplay as their UI. But like I said, the whole point of this is that we have a kickoff point. We have a starting point for the conversation. And we build up this body of work where it's not just We found some pretty pictures that we really like the look of loads of different elements, and we're trying to piece together some things to make a UI together. We've got a rhyme and a reason behind everything that we're doing. We've got a coherency behind everything, and we're building these anchor points. We're building this very strong foundation so that our UI art, you know, it's striking, it looks good. People dress up as it, because why wouldn't you? But it's the starting point. And like I said at the beginning, a lot of this is anecdotal from, like, you know, working in the industry for a long time and having to come up with UI styles and figuring them out and realizing that you can't just cherry pick the things that you like. You have to have a reason behind it. You have to be able to fight for it. And it doesn't consider things like, you know, branding or marketing. You might be working really closely with a marketing team or a branding team that've got some really strong ideas that you want to incorporate in this as well. That's absolutely something that you can add to the layers of your onion. Or you might be the 5th or 6th game in a series and you actually have a legacy of UI behind you. You're like, okay, how are we taking that, which is recognizably as our type of game, but we want to like modernize it or, you know, elevate it or bring it forward to a new generation? Do you have to? If you remade Final Fantasy VII today with the same UI from the old Final Fantasy VII, would people still vibe with that? Or do we have to modernize it? I mean, they chose to modernize it. I wouldn't have, but they chose to. And I promised I would finish early. So I apologize if I have talked really, really quickly. But that's it. That's the end of the talk. One slight last-minute sales pitch. We're hiring. So if anybody is in the art field, UI, UX, tech art, or anything else, let us know. Give us a shout and we can talk. But we have plenty of time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, please put your hand up. Please wait for a microphone and we can get into it.
I just wanted to ask, if you had to pick out a particular game with strong UI design, the game itself could be terrible, but you think the UI is absolutely fantastic, what kind of game would you pick out from that kind of aspect?
What's my favorite UI in a video game?
Basically.
If I say Persona 5, will the audience groan? Or does someone shout bingo? Because that's the point. I like a lot of games UIs. I like Personas. I think that's really strong. I love the treatment that they did with it. I love Alien Isolation's UI as well. Really, really immersive, really smart. They did some mad stuff as well for like this whole idea of like, if we couldn't build it in 1979, it's not going in the game. So all of like the flicker on the screens and like the scan lines is because they rendered the UI on a CRT TV and filmed it and then took that film on VHS and then digitalized it and then used that to make the effects for the crackle on the screens. You can fake that. You don't have to go through those steps to do it, but they did it because they wanted it to be authentic. Much respect for that. So I love those little tidbits. But if you wanted like for a stick-on UI that's very abstracted, I'd say Persona, and then for a very immersive one, definitely Alien Isolation.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's really good. You said like earlier at the beginning with like when you're comparing sort of immersive and abstract that you were saying like there is arguments to make for an abstract UI to kind of leave it as far to the end of the project as possible. Could you just talk a little bit about what the advantages would be for that?
Basically, the advantage of doing it that way around is the rest of the game has been built up, so you have a lot more to build your UI off of. So if you're trying, it can be really hard if you have an abstracted UI to try and do that at the beginning of the project because no one knows what the game's going to look like or feel like or what they want to lean into. But it might be like halfway through the project, like a fake brand in the world gets established and everyone like really leans into that. It's like, oh no, this is great. We should build our UI off of this. Or they create an operating system. Like if it's a hacking game and it's got its own operating system like that, oh, that's perfect. We can use that to build the UI with. That will really work. Or a character becomes very much a mascot of the game. It's like, okay, we want to use their personality, lean into that and make the UI out of that. So the more material you've already established throughout the rest of the project, that can really help when you're making an abstracted experience to like realize the project and bring it all together.
Okay, cool, thanks. Could I be cheeky and ask one more question?
Yeah.
So we're working on a management game at the moment, and one of the things we're looking at is having sort of almost two different types of UI, some which would be more direct instructional, let's say, like that's going to be like, okay, well, this key is to do such and such, and the other stuff would be more linked in with the kind of art from the game. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Do you get what I mean of having like the UIs that kind of serving slightly different purposes and the way they're communicating to the player?
Yeah, and I think tutorials do this a lot, right? So any tutorial elements tend to not necessarily always flow with the same vibe that you've got with the rest of the game, even for an immersive experience, because you're purposefully taking your time out of it to introduce mechanics. Again, it kind of depends on the kind of game that you're making. If you want to keep it separate, it's a choice you can make it. Just try and find some consistency across like font choices or the way that you're bringing in things to the screen or the way you're removing things from the screen. But if there's a character in the game, or you can build a character that becomes like the narrator or becomes the person that gives you instructions, and you can build like a personality, and you can be the delivery format for it, then you can come up with like a neat way of having a different way of delivering your UI, but you're keeping it in theme with the rest of the game. There's nothing necessarily wrong with having two things, but just keep in mind, like, does the second thing that you've got look like it belongs to a completely different game? Is there ways that you can tie it in with the rest of the game that you've come up with? Because it can come across of like, well, this went in last minute. They didn't put enough thought or effort into this bit. Even if you made a conscious choice at the beginning to be like, we want this to be really clean and really understandable to the player.
Brilliant. Thank you.
No worries.
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah, really enjoying this talk. So thank you. I'm wondering kind of how you see, or in your process, how you interact between UI, UX, and like game design. Obviously, technical designers, you have a whole list of people at your studio, but like how those interactions work, or like who kind of where, because I think it can get blurry between disciplines of like who's responsible for what and kind of who carries out and makes certain decisions. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
A lot of this, because obviously we outsource, so we work with our clients, it will come from the studio that we're working with. Usually they have like quite a strong vision holder for projects, and it's always a blessing when you have someone who is a very strong vision holder for a game, because they've got it clear in their head. And sometimes the idea that they've got in their head is not what you end up with, because you have those conversations and it's like, okay, that's cool, but wouldn't it be cool if, and you like lean off and build up things. But yeah, there can be like a blur of things where people will be like, oh, I'm going to take it in this direction, or I'm going to take it in that direction. You need to communicate more than you think, like over communicate as much as possible. People will happily tell you like, okay, you don't need to have a meeting every 5 minutes kind of thing, but make sure you're communicating a lot, showing a lot of images as you're going along, showing stuff as early as possible as well. This is something that is really difficult for artists to do, and I suffer with this myself, but show those sketches as early as possible. Even if you're like, I know it's not the final work and I'm sorry, but I just wanted to get this idea across to you, like have the conversation, because the worst thing you can do is spend a week working on that, and then it's like, oh no, this is completely not the way to go. If only you come to me sooner, right? So communicate as much as possible. Hope that you already have someone who is a strong vision holder for it. And if not, and you can see a clear path to like, this would be great, we want to build it up in this way, then put yourself in that shoe and like really advocate for your ideas and your design, and get people like to follow you and get people on board with it. And that way you can make sure that everything's cohesive and stays together, which is why having like the steps going through the line and going through the different layers, you can present that to people, and then they get the ideas and the rationale and the reasons why you want to do the things that you want to do, and everyone can be on board because, we're all on the same page. We've all understood the vibe. We've got the assignment. We can roll with it. Thanks. I hope that helps.
Hey, thanks very much for the talk.
No worries.
When it comes to projects that you're dealing with that are, say, like cross-platform, cross-play, where you've got, I guess, different screen resolutions, different real estate with screen sizes, how are you doing things when it comes to like font choices and font sizes, I suppose, when it comes to like platforms like the Switch Lite versus obviously high-end PC? I guess in terms of your approach to dealing with that.
Well, a lot of platform holders have like some clear guidelines on what they want for those minimum font sizes to be. So it's always worth checking in with those first. Also, if you're talking like for fonts in particular with accessibility, there's a lot of resource online for these are really good choices to make, especially for subtitles and especially for minimum font sizes. So those are definitely worth looking up. Can I play that.com does some really good like bits of advice on those. But testing is like your friend, like as much as like show everything as early as possible, get everything on device as early as possible, especially if it's mobile and you can get a hold of a bunch of different devices so you can test it as quickly as possible to make sure that, like, yeah, no, I can read this from a reason. I'm not like this all the time, and I get the information across. And I also recommend on that note, just doing a quick bit of Google Translate and put everything in the longest version as you can, so French or German for your whole UI, and double check it with that.
We've definitely been doing that stuff. In terms of for art style choices, when it comes to things like scaling, I suppose you're building in scaling solutions so it still looks sort of attractive visually on those big screens. Right?
Yeah, 100%. Adaptive UIs are not the easiest things to build, but if you know from the very beginning that, okay, this is going on like 6 different platforms, so it needs to hit these minimum screen sizes, you can build that from the beginning. So when you are like doing your high fidelity mockups of what the UI looks like, don't just do it on 4K TV with the one the way it looks the prettiest. Make sure you're doing it down the different sizes for sure. And there's we're very lucky at Atomorg Advanced where we have the tech art team. So if it's like we're doing a project and it's across a bunch of different platforms, can you help us out with some tooling so we can get the adaptive UIs to work? We've got those guys on board and they help me out with a lot of the technical stuff. They're basically wizards. So it's good.
Cool, thanks.
No worries. But I definitely like to do best and worst case scenarios with UI mockups. Like this is the biggest, prettiest version of it. This is the smallest, most dangerous version of it with everything in French or German. So it's a good practice.
Oh, hi, great talk. I'm interested in, I'm going to put this very clumsily, I guess the language of movement maybe that might go between the UI and other elements within the game, or other disciplines within the game. How do you arrive at something like that or communicate it to the rest of the team?
So movement in terms of like how things are appearing on screen or how things are moving across. Yeah. Mock up as quick and dirty as you can what those movements and interactions need to look like. Packages like Figma and, rest in peace, XD, did do some really cool, very quick motion tools that you could use to show, like, I want it to move in this direction. Or even, like, I will animate stuff in Photoshop constantly and save out GIFs and send it to people on Slack or whatever. So it's like, I've got this idea for a thing, I want it to move in this kind of direction. What do you think? And then they can give you, like, some quick feedback on, yeah, not like that. Or, yeah, this is leaning in the right direction. Can we get a better mock-up of it? And then you go into, like, After Effects or your animation program of choice and try and come up with a better mock-up of it. Usually with these things, then I'll work with the UI engineers or the tech team to be like, this is what the target visualization is for it. Like, how can you help me build it, kind of thing. So with a lot of these things, like the communication is key as early as possible and get those quick and dirty mock-ups out there so that you can see it's going to kind of go in this direction. But have the conversation, never send those things blind because people will think it's the final version and they're like, oh, that's a bit rough. And like, no. It's like half an hour mock-up, just want to show you this could be the transition. This could be the way it appears.
Thank you.
No worries. Any more for any more? We got 5 more minutes, so we can get maybe 1 or 2. Also, was anyone expecting me to talk about Dead Space? Yeah.
Hey, that was awesome. Yeah, seeing as you mentioned Figma, I was just wondering how Atomorg you approach design systems, and if, like, as an external team, that kind of thinking is a bit deep for maybe what you're brought in to do, or is that something you embrace and kind of use when you're building stuff out for a client? Yeah,
100%. Every interaction, every engagement we do, it's always led by the client. So if they want us to be more on the design side of things, then we kind of do, like, across the team, people have their own specializations, right? So if they need people who are more design oriented, then we've got specialists in UX design, right? So they can get on board with them and help visualize the UX approach to the designs. And then we can get the artists in as well to help pretty it all up and make the high fidelity mock-up. So it always depends on the project we're working on, but we try and make sure we have the best person on it. So, and we try and make sure that when we hire people on the team, like I say, we all come from game design, so we've all kind of done a bit of everything from grey boxing to implementation. It's just some people have got more of an expertise in one vein than the other, so we'll work that way. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
We get one more. One at the front. See, I say I finished early, but actually it was just so I have lots of time for questions.
Hello.
Hello.
What advice do you have for a project where the art style requires a lot of immersion, but the design requires a lot of abstraction?
That's a very interesting question. So which part? So the design's abstracted, but the art's immersive, was that?
Yeah, so the art style requires, well, say the art director wants the game to be very immersive, but the design department wants everything to be very abstracted.
So there are some things you can't fix in the UI, and infighting with the C-suite is one of them. At the end of the day, you have to figure out what's going to serve the game best. Like, is that immersive experience the best solution for the player? Like, if you sat them down with it, do they get the best version of that game? Or actually, does it make more sense that it's more score attack and it's more like hit numbers and health bars and stuff? Does that make more sense to the player? Is that the feel that you want? This is why you have to get the vibe of the game nailed. And if you've got like the design and the art are like pulling apart in different directions, that's when you need to get that vision holder to come in and be like, okay, but look, it doesn't serve the player. So having that that player-centric person in that conversation really helps, because ultimately, like, your design might be the best design ever and your art might be the best art ever, but if the players can't play it and they don't get the information that you want them to get, then it doesn't matter. So you have to find a middle ground. You have to find a way to make it work, and it's either going to lean one way or the other, but have the conversation and make sure it serves the ultimate product that you want to put out there.
Thank you.
No worries. Cool. Then I think we can all go and get a beer. Thank you.